Never in the course of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few. Winston Churchill, August 20th, 1940. Here's another one. Here's the lesson. Never give in. Never, 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 never in anything, great or small, large or petty. Never give in except in convictions of honor or good sense. Never yield to force. Never yield to the appearance of overwhelming might by the enemy. End quote. Winston Churchill, October 29th, 1941, the Harrow School for Boys. Hi, I'm Joseph Rupp. Welcome to the Motivation Lab, episode 5. So in this episode, I'm going to talk about the connection between the power of language and its effect on motivating us to do things. Now, I'm using a really big example in part because as a kid, I was very drawn to Winston Churchill, as many people were, as a figure of really incredibly diverse pursuits. Not only was he Prime Minister of England twice, from 1940 to 1945, and then later from 51 to 55, he was kind of a man for all seasons. He literally wrote close to 8 to 10 million words over the course of his lifetime, which included 40 books, 2 movie scripts, 1 novel, and incredible number of speeches. Now, the speeches are what gets an incredible amount of notoriety, and rightly so. If you looked at the list of great orators of the 20th century, he would be right at the top of the list. And in fact, if you just looked at historical figures during the 20th century, if it was Time magazine, for example, or the BBC, either one ranks him anywhere from 1st to 10th on the list of most impactful figures. Now, he was not without his detractors, and by the way, history has not treated many of his positions very kindly, especially when it comes to India or the women's vote at the time or some other matters. So I am not trying to valorize or glorify him, but I am trying to give you a perspective of some of the things that he did that are worthy of incredible mention. Now, the 2 speeches that I have quoted, the first one was done to the British House of Commons, again on August 20th, 1940, and the importance of this is that took place during the Battle of Britain. And so a little bit of history, just stick with me for a second. The Germans had overtaken not just Poland and Czechoslovakia, but in quick order over a 6-week period of time, they took over the lowlands and France, which included, by the way, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and of course France. And they took it over because of blitzkrieg tactics, the lightning war. At the point in time, Winston Churchill and the British people felt like they not only lost their allies, the United States had not joined the war yet, but they were alone and they were at the mercy of this incredible onslaught, right? And so at the time, he was trying to use language to mobilize the English people. And in fact, Edward R. Murrow, the famous American journalist, said that he weaponized the English language and then sent it into battle. And of course, that is a great image for you to think about even for yourself. By the way, the second quote that I mentioned is very absolute in the use of its language. And that speech was given to the Harrow School for Boys, again on October 29th, 1941. The date is also important because the United States had still not entered the war. So Churchill, over the course of his lifetime, as I mentioned, I think beforehand, wrote an enormous body of work. So he was known as a writer, as a journalist, as a novelist, as a biographer. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953. But in addition to that, he's a compelling figure because of the other pursuits that he followed that I think kept him sane. By the way, he suffered from depression. He called it Black Dog, and it would enter his life many times. But he found many ways and many things that can remind us of our own capacity to do different things. He was a painter. He did 550 paintings during his lifetime. He never sold one of them. He gave them to colleagues and to friends. And in fact, one of them recently was sold for about $475,000 US. By somebody who was a groundskeeper for him back in the 50s. So that gives you an idea of how he thought about it. But in addition to that, he was a bricklayer. And at one point in time, as a bricklayer, he had a goal to write 2,000 words a day and to lay 200 bricks in constructions around his home on Chartwell, that was in Kent, by the way, in England. And Chartwell was one of the great loves, aside from obviously his family and his wife. But Churchill is a compelling figure for all of those reasons. Now, the important thing for us to consider, at least, is the power of language on the mind. And so in the second quote I gave you, Churchill mentions the word never 8 times. The old brain, the brain that developed first, a little bit of neuroscience, is the deciding part of our brain, right? So the neocortex, the new part of the brain, the midbrain, emotions, the old brain is really about deciding. And so you may want to think about how you can use language for yourself, especially maybe in your own self-talk, to motivate yourself. And I use this really grand example because Churchill used language again to mobilize many audiences. The first and foremost were the British people, but beyond that, and think about it, by the way, the speech to Harrow's schoolboys, a lot of them were going to be seeing the front lines or Lee's military duty over the next 5 to 6 years, and he knew that. And so he wanted to mobilize them, but he wanted to mobilize the British people, and he had other audiences as well. Those examples are really important to just think about in terms of impact. Now, there are multiple parts of this motivation lab. So one of them, of course, is just the figure of Winston Churchill, maybe some of the lessons you could take away to be motivated by the other things you could do potentially in your life. Because he had multiple occupations and varied occupations, right? He was really hitting both sides of his brain. He was not just Prime Minister, he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, he was the First Lord of the Admiralty, he had many other ministerial positions in addition to being a member of Parliament, for example, but he also was, again, a novelist, an author. Novelist, only one novel, but multiple other things. So you can see your life in kind of the same way. Now, back to the question for you. The question really is, do you ever think about the way language impacts your own efforts towards whatever development you're thinking about? And how can you potentially use language to change your perspective on the goals that you are pursuing, whether they are short-term or long-term? So that's part of the motivation lab, right? To think about that relationship. Thanks so much for stopping by. I really appreciate you joining this session. Welcome to the Motivation Lab.